This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is the executive editor of Agri-Pulse, Philip Brasher. He discusses the Farm Bill and components of it that are critical to agriculture. Philip Brasher keeps the show going as he continues the conversation with what he is expecting moving forward in Washington, D.C. as it relates to agriculture and Congress. We are also joined by K-State Beef Extension veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff as he reminds producers about a few ways to mitigate heat. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk completes the show as he discusses the importance of accurately determining the dry matter content of dry feeds. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with some more information about the Farm Bill. We have been hearing from Jenny Ift, K-State Agriculture Policy Specialist. However, this time we're joined by Executive Editor of Agri-Pulse, Philip Brasher. Philip, thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Great to be here.
A little bit of background about you. First off, just saying you're from D.C., so a little bit different perspective than a K-State employee.
Well, I'm based in D.C. I want you to know I'm originally from West Texas. Not a lot of similarity with Western Kansas, where I grew up. So, yes, but I've been in Washington as a journalist for the last 34 years.
Gaining a lot of information, I'm sure, from your time then in D.C. And so as we talk about the Farm Bill, first discussing some important players in the Farm Bill.
Well, by far the most important players are what we call the four corners, the chairs and ranking members of the House and Senate Agriculture Committee. That's Debbie Stabenow, who chairs the Senate Agriculture Committee. This is going to be her third Farm Bill. And then the ranking Republican on the committee is John Bozeman from Arkansas. Then over on the House side, you have the chairman, Glenn G.T. Thompson, who's from Pennsylvania, represents a large district in central Pennsylvania, and David Scott, a Democrat from Georgia, is the ranking member.
And with those four corners, kind of also shows how many new people are working on this Farm Bill.
Right. About roughly three-fourths of the House Agriculture Committee was not on the committee, did not take part in, did not vote or at all on the 2018 Farm Bill, the last Farm Bill. So they're rookies. About half of the Senate Agriculture Committee was not there in 2018.
And so before we start talking about the 2023 Farm Bill, kind of looking a little bit back at the 2018 and as it's kind of nearing its expiration date, but you said it doesn't actually expire.
No, there are pieces of it that expire September 30th. Most of the big ticket items really don't. The crop insurance program, which is the absolute number one priority I know to producers all across the country now, is permanently authorized. Congress doesn't have to do anything. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which cost-wise is by far the biggest part of the farm program, it is reauthorized every year through the appropriations process. So it's not affected by what happens with the Farm Bill. Conservation programs, most of those were authorized and then reauthorized through 2031, I believe, in the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed last year. So they're not affected by September 30th. The commodity programs are tied to, for the most part, to the marketing year for particular crops. So with corn and soybeans, that marketing years run through next August. So those for the payments for that crop year that are not affected by the September 30th. There are a few smaller programs that are affected. The biggest one concerned to Congress is the dairy program, which will expire December 31st. And at that point, because of a permanent law provision been in successive farm bills as a trigger to get a stick, if you will, to get Congress to pass another farm bill. When that dairy program expires, USDA would have to revert to a 1949 law, which would require them to buy it. In short, it would dramatically increase milk and dairy prices, something that the Congress can't let happen. And so that is the impetus for Congress to either pass an extension of the 2018 Farm Bill or pass a new Farm Bill. They're very likely to have to pass at least a short-term extension of the 2018 Farm Bill, but that really won't have to be done until early in 2024. I mean, they could do it earlier, but they will have to do something early on in 2024.
So when do you expect for it to be done?
I mean, I would expect sometime in 2024, maybe likely the first half of 2024. Just the committees would like to bring out their bills this fall, possibly September. Maybe we could see action in October, November, probably a little more likely. But just the process of getting them through the committee onto the floor in both the House and the Senate, and then negotiating the differences between the two bills typically takes at least 6 months, 8 months or more. I mean, the last bill was done pretty quickly, and I think it took about start to finish about 8 months. So you're talking, well into 2024. Just the practical issues with the process.
Sheer magnitude also probably of the Farm Bill and a lot of things incorporated into the Farm Bill as we've talked about. And one of the things that you brought up in a past presentation was changes with reference prices being a topic of conversation.
This is probably the biggest single, with no question, it's the biggest single issue that the committees are wrestling with because of the increases in fertilizer and other input prices the last few years. There's a lot of pressure from commodity groups to increase the reference prices that trigger payments under the price loss coverage program, and to address some issues with the other major commodity program, Agricultural Risk Coverage, ARC. But it's expensive to do. And the cheapest thing to do, the least expensive thing to do would be to maybe target it to different commodities, the higher input costs and so forth. But then that brings up a whole set of new issues to political issues and regional issues if you favor one commodity over another. So it's difficult for them to do anything that's not across the board that doesn't benefit every commodity equally. But it gets pretty expensive. They have a cost estimate from the Congressional Budget Office of about $24 billion to do just a 10% increase in reference prices, which doesn't necessarily make that much of a difference for some commodity like soybean. So in $24 billion is a very large amount of money when you consider that the commodity title of the Farm Bill under current law is projected to cost $62 billion over 10 years. So you're talking about a roughly 40% increase for just what would be a relatively minor tweak to reference prices. So it's very expensive. So it's a very tricky, difficult issue for these committees to deal with.
Something else also involving money then, mandatory base acres, possibly wanting an update, but how realistic is that?
It'd be very difficult to do, and partly because it creates a lot of winners and losers, not among states, among commodities, among individual farmers. You could have winners and losers between one and the same county. This has to do with the issue that commodity payments are linked to a farm's base acreage, what is essentially what the crops that farm grew over about 20 to 25 years ago. That's when this base acre allocation was originally done. There was some update in the 2014 Farm Bill, but largely it's fixed by the allocation back in between 1998 and 2001. Well, there have been some big changes, including right here in Kansas, in what farmers grow. There's corn growing on land, even out to western Kansas, dryland corn that was wheat ground 2 decades ago. That's true in a lot of other states. You go to California, in that case, they're not growing program crops, but they're still getting payments because they have like cotton base or rice base or wheat base. So there are groups. The National Corn Growers Association has been the lead in this and saying this needs to be redone. There's a lot of concern about particularly young farmers who don't have base acres, don't have access to base. Affects the land values. It means they don't have that safety net coverage with the commodity title and the price loss coverage and the agricultural risk coverage. But again, changing that creates a lot of winners and losers. And members of Congress, they like to give more money to constituents. They don't like to take money away from constituents. And they really don't like voting for something when they don't even know what the result could be, because the impact on an individual farmer is going to be very different and very important. So it's a very challenging issue. I think they still would like to do something for especially these younger farmers who don't have access to base, maybe because they bought cheaper land which didn't have base attached to it, didn't have a commodity base attached to it. So they would really like to do something for those producers, but it's a tough issue, and it can be a very expensive issue depending on unless you do that mandatory base update, which as I just said, is very difficult politically to do. It saves money that ultimately could be plowed back into programs, but you create all these losers, potentially people losing money, and that's a political problem.
Are there hoping to be changes of how payments out for conservation are done?
Well, the big issue in terms of the conservation title is the amount of money that was put in through the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the centerpiece of President Biden's climate policy. Basically created a lot of tax incentives, but also in terms of agriculture, one of the most important things the bill did was put about $18 billion into 4 major conservation programs, including the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, and then a couple of others as well.
That was executive editor of Agri-Pulse from Washington, D.C., Philip Brasher, as he shared information from the perspective as someone who's been in Washington, D.C. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Philip as he continues his conversation about the Farm Bill and shares a few things to be looking ahead for in agriculture and Congress. We'll also be joined by A.J. Tarpoff, Keith State beef veterinarian, as he discusses a few things that producers need to keep in mind when it comes to heat stress mitigation. We're cutting to that short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with you in a moment. Tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now with the executive editor of Agri-Pulse, Philip Brasher. He continues his conversation about conservation programs in the Farm Bill.
That money right now is sitting outside the Farm Bill because of the process by which it was put into law and the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted. They would like to bring that money into the Farm Bill because if they did, they could reallocate it in a way that the budget rules would allow or would have the effect of permanently increasing the funding levels for those conservation programs. But they have to bring it into the Farm Bill to do this. There's some issues with that. Republicans would like to go a step farther. They'd like to bring it into the Farm Bill and reallocate it possibly to the commodity title or take some of the restrictions off of that funding in terms of how it's spent. But that's all going to come down to the chairwoman of the Senate Ag Committee, Debbie Stabenow. She's the one who got that money in there. She has been insistent. It is a red line that money stay in the programs, stay in conservation, and that it remain devoted to incentivizing climate, what we call climate smart practices. So that's probably that is the biggest single issue in terms of the conservation title.
And something that's happened then this past year is the Prop 12, which came out of California. And are you seeing some things take place around that?
Well, the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, Glenn Thompson, really wants to put a provision in the Farm Bill. It's called the EATS Act. Senator Marshall of Kansas is one of the Senate sponsors. It would basically prohibit states from imposing standards on agricultural products that are produced in other states. Prop 12 in California, as referenced, set standards for how eggs and pork are produced in other states in terms of it bans the use of gestation crates for sows and requirements for housing laying hens. The egg industry is largely adapted to it. The pork industry is pushed back. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. So now the kind of the last ditch effort to try to stop Prop 12 and stop in other states from adopting similar standards is what we call the EATS Act. As I mentioned, Thompson wants to put that in the Farm Bill. There's already a very concerted effort from animal welfare groups. They are lobbying even as we talk today. They've been working Capitol Hill to stop it. I think they feel fairly optimistic It'd be very difficult to get through the Senate even if you get it out of the House. But that is going to be a significant issue in the Farm Bill, no question.
In talking about the Senate and the House, Congress overall has pretty narrow margins when we look towards the Farm Bill. And so does that play an impact on possibly things getting through?
The biggest impact is in the House, in terms of getting the bill out of the House. You get it to the floor, Republicans have a very, very narrow margin. Now, last time, 2018, they brought out a Republican-only bill out of committee. It was a partisan bill because of cuts it made to SNAP, a Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. They got it to the House floor. Everything went well until to the very last vote because there was essentially no Democratic support for the bill. There was a group of conservatives, members of the House Freedom Caucus, who were basically empowered to make some demands. And their demand essentially was that they wanted a separate vote on immigration reform. They voted down the bill. They eventually reached a accommodation with the leadership and were able to pass it. But that's what happens if you have a partisan bill. You've got to hold your party together, and the leadership couldn't do that initially back in 2018. The margin is so narrow this time that the leadership probably can't hold together, or there's a very high risk that they couldn't hold together enough Republican support to pass a partisan bill. So the plan, at least so far, is to bring it out of committee and to bring it to the floor as a bipartisan bill so that they have Democratic support. They need Democratic support not only to pass the bill on the final vote, but they also need Democratic support to defeat a lot of amendments that would put new restrictions on crop insurance, means test, premium subsidies. There's going to be almost certainly an amendment to put some restrictions on checkoff programs, and there will be a number of other amendments that the House Ag Committee wants to keep off. And they are going to need Democratic votes to offset the votes that those amendments are going to get from the Republican side. So it's going to be they've got a balancing act of keeping Democrats in line, and they would hope on the final bill getting a bipartisan vote. It actually gives it, when you have a bipartisan vote coming out of the House, it gives it more weight politically going into the Senate too. You got Democratic. It's almost always the case. A bill that's got a large bipartisan margin gets a certain momentum that a partisan bill doesn't, even though the partisan bill passes.
So as we look ahead, any big things on the horizon in D.C.?
Well, that's number one. In terms of strictly agriculture, I think the biggest issue going on in Congress right now is what's going to happen. The fiscal 2023 ends September 30th. They have not passed the appropriations bills. They couldn't even pass the agriculture appropriations bill, which is fair. They couldn't even bring it up for a vote, actually, in July. It's normally one of the least controversial. But because they couldn't get an agreement with some of their conservative members on amendments, they finally had to start their recess without voting on that bill. So we don't know if we have chances of a shutdown at the beginning of October, government shutdown at the beginning of October, unless they get some kind of agreement. It's a very unpredictable situation. But that's that in terms of the larger picture is and it bleeds over into the Farm Bill potentially as well. It's this whole debate and uncertainty about the budget in fiscal 2024 and whether the government continues to operate and whether these conservative members of their House are going to demand deeper cuts in spending.
Philip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us an update of things you're seeing in D.C. with the Farm Bill and agriculture.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
That was executive editor of Agri-Pulse Philip Brasher. Before we cut to a break, we're going to be joined by K-State beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff as he shares a few things producers need to keep in mind with these extremely hot days we've been experiencing.
It all begins with management, how we handle these animals, when we move these animals, if we have to process them and they're new on arrival, or say we have to ship and we're shipping some of those animals. Making sure that we aren't handling these animals, increasing their body temperatures during the heat of the day. If we need to process, if we need to move pens, if we need to ship animals, we need to try to have that wrapped up by about 10 a.m. If we can do that, we can let them settle, they can cool themselves, and so we aren't adding to some of that heat load issue during the heat of the day. 2, there's a concept known as the heat of fermentation. So remember, we don't feed cattle, we feed the rumen microbes. So these microbes, these bacteria, they break down the feedstuffs. Well, that comes at a cost, and one of those costs is it releases heat. So during the summer months, that's counterproductive. So we want to make sure that whatever ration, whatever feeds that we're feeding, they're easily digestible, okay? Because the easier digestible feedstuffs don't produce as much heat of fermentation. We want to make sure that we might actually change some of our feed timing. So the heat of fermentation maximizes about 4 hours after we feed. So to make sure we aren't building up too much heat during the day, we may deliver most of our daily feed in the evening hours to make sure that that heat of fermentation is happening overnight so we don't have compounding effects. But also, number 1 is water. So when the temperatures rise from about 70 to 90 degrees, the water consumption and the water needs increase by 2 times. And that can happen really quick. So cattle use that extra water, they consume that to help cool themselves, and it's a big driver to make sure that they maintain what we call homeostasis, or regular body temperature. If you're worried about water tank capacity and availability, is there an opportunity to think outside of the box to increase water availability? Check the pumps, making sure that we have plenty of flow to make sure that if they're going to be consuming a lot, we need plenty of it and enough volume for all those animals to consume it. I guess the other side of heat stress mitigation is environmental. And it comes down to some of the basics. We want to improve airflow. We want to make sure that these animals are comfortable in their given environment. Now, pasture animals, we have less of a concern with heat stress. Okay, they naturally find some of those key areas of the pasture. When we have animals in confinement, it's up to us to make sure that we both construct these pens correctly. They have proper drainage so we don't increase humidity, but also, maybe some other tools, and we'll talk about that. So mounds in the center of pens. It's amazing how much that the pen construction, whenever we have mounds, helps with drainage, but it also gives the opportunity that cattle climb to the top of those mounds and they actually catch a breeze that's just a little bit elevated. 2, sprinklers, right? Often folks might utilize sprinklers for dust control. Sprinklers can be used in the feedlot scenario. They're used constantly on the dairy side to wet cattle as they go in and out of the parlors. But on the feedlot side, we usually use them for dust mitigation or in the overnight hours to cool the pen floor. So we will actually wet the pen floor to allow evaporation to occur, and that evaporation pulls the heat out of that dirt floor. So it's kind of unless we can wet those animals completely, it's counterproductive. But we use them to actually cool the pen, not the cattle themselves. Because keep in mind, during the heat of the day, a pen floor can get upwards to 140 degrees.
That was Key State Extension beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff. I will link our full interviews discussing these topics in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's Milk Lines. A cost-saving measure that producers might not be taking advantage of is accurately determining the dry matter content of their dry feeds. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that if the feeding management software being used is not correct, producers may be overfeeding animals in order to get the amount of protein the animals actually need. He says this can result in increased feed costs. Today, Mike looks at how much that could be costing producers.
Today, I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the dry matters of the feeds that they're feeding to your animals every day. For many years, we've done an excellent job of trying to track our wet feeds that we feed in terms of dry matter content. Many of our dairies determine the dry matter content of those types of feedstuffs like silages or, say, wet corn gluten feed or wet distillers grains actually several times a week and make adjustments to their rations accordingly. However, as we look at some more recent data that has come to light, it might also be important for us to start considering dry matter content of some of our dry feeds that we feed in larger amounts. In particular, we might want to look at any feed that we feed at more than 5 pounds per head per day, or in some cases maybe even as little as 2 or 3 pounds, depending on the value of that particular product. So what am I talking about? Well, as you think about something like soybean meal that we would add in fairly large quantities to most dairy rations, particularly for the lactating dairy cows, there's the dry matter content that we plug into the ration formulation, and then there's a second dry matter content that we need to be concerned about, and that is what's actually entered into the feeding management software that you're using on your dairy. Those numbers really do need to be the same, and they need to be accurate based on the feed that you're feeding. So, for example, many of the book values for soybean meal will list its dry matter at about 88%. And that may well be what's actually plugged into the software that you're using to balance rations, and possibly the same number that's plugged in on your feed management software that manages the amounts that you feed to your animals every day. The true value for that might be something more like 92 or 93%. So we could be off somewhere between 3 and 5% on the actual dry matter content, something like soybean meal, which is actually a high-value product that we put into the dairy. What this may translate into is the fact that you may be overfeeding the amount of soybean meal that you actually need to feed to get to the amount of protein that those animals actually need. So, by correcting the issues that may exist between what's value you're using to balance rations and also the value that is utilized in your feed management software, you may be able actually to save somewhere between 3 and 5 cents per cow per day on these types of feed. So, how do we do that? Well, number one, it's probably important to pull some samples and get some actual dry matter contents. Don't necessarily need full feed analysis, just the actual dry matter content of, say, your soybean meal or maybe your dried distiller's grains. Keeping in mind that when you switch sources, and sometimes when we're buying commodities, that does happen fairly often, we need to recheck the dry matter, because sources of soybean meal, for example, coming from different processing plants may have different dry matter contents. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider tracking the dry matter content of dry feeds as well as the wet feeds on their farms.
Thanks, Mike. And this reminder to listen to the podcast version of Agriculture Today, visit agtoday.net, agtoday.net, or using an app on your mobile device, type these search keywords, Agriculture, Today, Kansas, and you'll find this program. By tapping the subscribe button, brand new episodes of Agriculture Today will automatically arrive on your device. That's agtoday.net. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.